A door opens at 6:14 in the morning, not 6:15, not 6:13, 6:14. The same hand reaches for the same lock. The same shoe crosses the same threshold. The same man steps into the same street, carrying the same leather bag, and turns left. He has done this every weekday morning for almost 3 years. He does not know that someone once wrote down the time. He does not know that someone wrote it down again the next day, and the day after that, and that after 17 days of writing it down, they stopped. Not because the information was no longer useful, because it was complete. A woman on the floor above watches him leave from a window she never opens all the way. She is holding a glass of water. She does not look like she is watching anything. Too lost, a man in a parked car adjusts his mirror. He is not checking traffic. Somewhere far from this street, in a room the target has never seen and will never see, a file has grown thick enough that it no longer needs new pages. The only thing left to decide is when. This channel exists to show how power is actually exercised behind the scenes. If that's useful to you, you'll want to be here. The man's name was Khaled Nasser. He was born in 1951 in a village outside Sedan, the second son of a schoolteacher who moved the family to Beirut when Khaled was 9. He studied engineering at the American University of Beirut, graduated with modest distinction, and found work with a Lebanese construction firm that managed public infrastructure contracts across the region. His professors remembered him as diligent but unremarkable. His classmates remembered him less than that. He was the kind of student who sat in the third row, took careful notes, and left without lingering. By the mid-1970s, he had settled into the kind of life that produces no headlines. He married a woman from a family his mother approved of. They had 2 daughters, 3 years apart. They lived in a modest apartment in a residential quarter of a city that had seen enough war to make quiet living feel like an achievement. Nasser did not drink. He did not socialize beyond family obligations. He came home at the same time each evening and sat in the same chair reading the same newspaper. His neighbors considered him pleasant and forgettable, which was exactly how he preferred it. What made Khaled Nasser a person of interest to Israeli intelligence had nothing to do with construction. Through family connections to the Palestinian community in southern Lebanon, and through relationships formed during his university years, Nasser had become a financial conduit. Not the kind who moved millions through offshore banks or laundered weapons profits across borders. Something smaller, quieter, and in many ways more dangerous. He facilitated the movement of modest sums between donor networks in the Gulf and operational cells in Lebanon and the occupied territories. The amounts were unremarkable. A few $1,000s here, a transfer routed through a Beirut money exchange there. Nothing that would trigger alarms in any financial monitoring system. But those sums funded safe houses. They paid for documents. They kept people fed while they planned things that would eventually become headlines. Israeli intelligence identified Nasser not through dramatic intercepts or agent recruitment, but through accounting. Analysts tracing financial patterns across dozens of transactions noticed that certain sums appeared and disappeared with a regularity that suggested a single organizing hand. The amounts were too consistent to be coincidental, too dispersed to come from a single source, and too well timed to be anything but coordinated. Somewhere in the middle of these flows sat a person who understood how to move money without attracting attention. It took months to narrow the possibilities. When they did, the name that surfaced was unremarkable. An engineer, a family man, someone who kept regular hours. The decision to place Nasser under sustained observation was not made lightly, and it was not made quickly. He was not a military commander. He was not a bomb maker. He was not someone whose face appeared on wanted lists or whose name carried weight in the rhetoric of resistance. He was a facilitator, The kind of figure who makes violence administratively possible without ever touching a weapon. And that made him both valuable and difficult. Valuable because disrupting his network would sever connections that had taken years to build. Difficult because the very qualities that made him effective, his ordinariness, his discipline, his refusal to draw attention, also made him nearly invisible. What arrived first was not a team, it was a question. How does a man who never changes his behavior reveal the shape of his life to someone watching from the outside? The answer, it turned out, was that he already had. He just didn't know it. Khaled Nasser woke every morning at 5:45. He prayed, he dressed. He ate breakfast alone in the kitchen while his wife and daughters slept. He left the apartment at 6:14. He walked 2 blocks south to a bakery on Rue Hamra, where he bought a manashi and a small coffee. He carried both to a bench near a pharmacy, sat for 11 minutes, finished eating, folded the wrapper into his pocket, and continued on foot to his office. The walk took 14 minutes. He arrived between 6:42 and 6:45, depending on whether the traffic signal at the intersection near the post office was red or green. He entered through the side door of the building, not the main entrance. He took the stairs, not the elevator. He reached his desk, placed his bag on the left side of his chair, and began working. He did this on Monday. He did it on Tuesday. He did it on Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday. He did not do it on Saturday or Sunday, because on those days he stayed home until 9, took his daughters to visit his wife's mother in Verdun, and returned by early afternoon. Saturday lunch was always at the mother-in-law's apartment. Sunday lunch was always at home. He did not eat dinner at restaurants during the week. He did not go out in the evenings. He did not receive visitors after 8. His lights went off between 10:15 and 10:30 every night. The bedroom window faced east. None of this was security. None of it was caution. It was simply how he lived. And that was the problem. A man who varies his routine forces anyone watching him to adapt. He creates uncertainty. He introduces noise into the pattern that makes prediction unreliable and planning dangerous. A man who takes a different route to work each day, who eats at different restaurants, who changes his schedule without warning, is a man who cannot be located with confidence at any given moment. Even modest variation, leaving 5 minutes early, stopping at a different shop, walking on the opposite side of the street, introduces enough disorder that sustained observation requires larger teams, longer timelines, and greater risk of exposure. Khaled Nasser introduced none of this disorder. His life was a single line drawn over and over on the same piece of paper until the groove cut through to the other side. Every morning was the previous morning. Every evening was the previous evening. His precision was not the precision of a man who valued discipline. It was the precision of a man who had never considered that his habits might be legible to someone else. He lived as though observed by no one, because in his understanding of himself and his place in the world, he was observed by no one. He was an engineer who facilitated transfers. He was not a target. Targets were men with bodyguards and armored cars and code names. Targets lived in compounds. Targets moved at night. Targets were important. Nasser didn't feel important, and that feeling was the most dangerous thing about him. The observation lasted 53 days. Not because 53 days was the prescribed duration, but because after 53 days there was nothing left to learn. Every route had been walked. Every shop had been visited. Every window had been noted. Every pattern had been confirmed so many times that the repetitions themselves became redundant. The file on Nasser read less like an intelligence dossier and more like a train schedule. Departure, arrival, duration, repeat. The few minor deviations that occurred during the observation period only reinforced the pattern. Twice he left the apartment at 6:16 instead of 6:14, both times following evenings when his younger daughter had been ill. Once he skipped the bakery entirely and walked directly to his office, arriving 12 minutes earlier than usual. That was a Thursday in the third week. He never did it again. The anomalies didn't introduce uncertainty. They confirmed how narrow his range of behavior actually was. Even his exceptions were predictable. This is the level of detail most public accounts never reach. That's the layer this channel focuses on. What 53 days of observation revealed was not just where NASA went, but where he didn't go. He never entered the Palestinian neighborhoods directly. He never visited the offices of any organization under surveillance. He never met with anyone whose name appeared in active intelligence files. His contact with the financial networks he serviced was conducted entirely through intermediaries who came to him, arriving at his office during business hours under the pretense of construction consultations. These meetings looked like work because they happened during work. They looked unremarkable because the man hosting them was unremarkable. The camouflage was not tradcraft, it was temperament. But observation also revealed something else, something quieter. NASA's routine didn't just describe his movements. It described his vulnerabilities. It showed which streets were empty when he walked them. It showed which buildings had unobstructed sight lines to the bench where he ate breakfast. It showed how long he sat with his back to the road, how many seconds elapsed between the moment he stood and the moment he entered the office building, and how narrow the corridor was between the side door and the stairwell. It showed that on the 4th floor. His desk sat beside a window that faced a construction site where scaffolding had remained erected for months. It showed that his apartment building had no security guard after 11 at night, and that the lobby door could be opened with a key that matched a common model. None of this information had been requested by NASA. None of it had been given willingly. It had been extracted from his own behavior, pulled from the shape of his days like thread from a garment that doesn't know it's unraveling. The decision about what to do with Kald NASA was made in Tel Aviv, not in Beirut. It was not made quickly. It sat on a desk for weeks while analysts weighed alternatives and operational planners assessed risk. The operational assessment, when it finally came, was straightforward in a way that belayed its weight. NASA's network was active. The funds he moved supported logistics for cells that had carried out attacks and were planning more. Disrupting the network required removing its organizing node. NASA could be arrested, but Lebanon's political landscape made extradition impossible and detention unreliable. He could be exposed, but public exposure would scatter the network without dismantling it, driving participants underground, where they would be harder to monitor. He could be turned, recruited as a double agent, but his profile suggested a man of deep personal conviction whose cooperation could not be purchased or coerced. The remaining option was the one that required the least ongoing management and produced the most permanent result. The plan did not require creativity, it required a calendar. NASA's route from the bakery to the bench took him along a stretch of pavement that ran beside a low wall separating the sidewalk from a parking area. For approximately 90 seconds each morning, he walked this stretch with no other pedestrians nearby. The bakery's morning rush hadn't started. The pharmacy didn't open until 7. The residential buildings on the opposite side of the street showed no activity at that hour beyond the occasional light in a kitchen window. The stretch was a corridor of solitude inside a city of millions, and NASA walked through it at the same time every morning. The morning it happened was a Tuesday, January. The air was cool and damp and carried the smell of diesel and baking bread. NASA left his apartment at 6:14. He walked south. He bought his manashi and his coffee. He turned the corner toward the bench. The street was empty. The pharmacy was dark. A white sedan sat in the parking area beside the low wall with its engine off and its windows down. Nasser walked past it without looking. He had walked past parked cars on this street hundreds of times. This one was not different, except that it was. What happened next took less than 9 seconds and was witnessed by no one whose account was ever made public. Nasser was found by a pharmacy employee arriving for the early shift. He was lying on the pavement beside the bench. His manashi was still in its paper wrapping on the ground next to him. His coffee had spilled. There was no sign of a struggle. There were no shell casings. There were no witnesses who reported hearing anything unusual. Lebanese police classified the death as a possible cardiac event pending autopsy. The autopsy was delayed. When it was finally conducted weeks later, the findings were inconclusive but noted minor anomalies that could not be satisfactorily explained by natural causes. The case was never officially resolved. It joined the long list of unexplained deaths in a city that had learned not to ask too many questions about men who died quietly. Nasser's network did not survive his absence. Within weeks, the financial channels he had maintained went silent. Intermediaries who had relied on his connections found themselves without a point of contact. Funds that had flowed through his careful architecture pooled in accounts that no one else knew how to access. 2 planned operations in the territories stalled for lack of logistical funding that had previously arrived without fail. A safe house in Sidon was abandoned when the monthly payments stopped. A courier network that moved documents between Beirut and Damascus lost its central point of coordination and fractured into disconnected pieces that could no longer trust each other. The infrastructure he had built, modest, invisible, and devastatingly effective, collapsed not because it was attacked, but because it had been designed around a single indispensable person. And that person had been identified, mapped, and removed with the same methodical patience that had built the network in the first place. No intelligence service claimed responsibility. No government acknowledged the operation. Nasser's family buried him and grieved privately. His colleagues at the construction firm remembered a quiet man who kept to himself and always arrived on time. His daughters grew up knowing their father had died suddenly one winter morning and that no one could explain exactly why. The absence of answers became its own kind of answer. One that his wife understood better than she ever admitted, and that his associates in the financial network understood immediately. The operational file on Khaled Nasser was closed and archived. It contained no dramatic revelations, no tales of daring infiltration, no accounts of technological wizardry or last-minute improvisation. It read like what it was. A record of patience applied to predictability until the outcome became arithmetic. 53 days of watching a man do the same thing at the same time in the same place, followed by a single morning when someone was waiting in the one corridor where no one else ever was. Because once you see how this was done, the operation itself stops being the important part. What lingers is its simplicity, and how unsettling it is. He wasn't hunted, he wasn't chased, he wasn't outsmarted, he was read, like a schedule pinned to a wall. And the most disturbing thing about Khaled Nasser isn't that his routine killed him. It's that he never once considered changing it. Not because he was careless, but because he never believed anyone was paying attention.